Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is October. We are in Wisconsin. It is a very sublime and beautiful fall day out there today. We had a really hot Indian summer kind of situation going on, but it's finally turned. And we are so glad you're here with us for our CommUniversity session for October 2025. We do host these sessions on a monthly basis during the academic semesters. I'll share a little bit more about that in just a moment, but just want to say hi and welcome you to this session, which is on anticipated 2025 federal policy impacts in the sector and communities. And we are excited today that we're going to be able to share a little bit from our perspectives here in Wisconsin, where we're having that beautiful October weather, but also hear from our colleagues on both of the coasts and the Gulf. And I think we might be joined by a colleague right nearby in a neighboring state of Iowa. In any case, I know that we're going to have a really rich discussion today about some very dynamic and urgent things that are happening in our country that certainly have a direct impact on our communities and the sector that tends to serve them, the nonprofit sector. I am Mary Beth Collins. I don't think I introduced myself, and I'll be kind of leading today and facilitating, and I'll share with you a little bit about our center before we get going. So next slide. So I'm fortunate to serve as the executive director of the Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We do teaching, research, and outreach focused on advancing the work of the civic and nonprofit sectors. Next slide. So today we are just delighted to be joined by some colleagues from, as I mentioned, the coasts and the Gulf, and hopefully a neighboring state. I want to give some credit to not only those organizations that are represented here today, and you'll hear a lot more from them. So we'll come back to their respective institutions throughout today's discussion. But I also want to give credit to our association that we participate in, Arnova, which has really connected a lot of us through this national and international conference where folks doing work researching the nonprofit sector, sometimes doing more academic work where we're kind of combining that community engagement and practice piece with research and or teaching about the sector. And I think all of the centers here today, as their names imply, and as our colleagues from them describe their work, are all doing some type of work with teaching, research, or outreach around the sector. So they're going to have great perspectives on what's going on in their regions. Next slide. So we are referring to, quote, policy changes in 2025, which essentially link to the new presidential administration. And there are 4 distinct phases that we're kind of thinking of in this work, at least at our center. Our center is engaged right now with partners in our county of Dane in Wisconsin, where Madison is located. We are working with the United Way and the Madison Community Foundation and several other organizations in our area to do some iterative reporting on what we know about policy changes in 2025 and beyond that are going to have impacts on communities and the nonprofit sector. And the way that our work is breaking down those stages is through the 4 kind of categories you see here on the slide. So we know that there has been a big push of executive orders, the biggest single kind of swath of executive orders in the shortest period of time that we've ever seen from a presidential administration that came out as early as January 2025, but there have been kind of ongoing additions to the list of executive orders, and of course, responses, including litigation and temporary restraining orders that have changed the impact of some of those initial executive orders. Many of them are still definitely in play. We also have been through the reconciliation legislation, which was passed in July of 2025, that is called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And I know others are referring to it differently for lots of different reasons. The official name of the legislation is still that. So I'm going to kind of, for our purposes, refer to it as OBA today. And then, of course, the last time we kind of convened around this stuff in September at our last CommUniversity session, we were thinking about what the next budget would look like and the way that folks were anticipating that would substantively shape up But what has occurred since then is we are actually in an active government shutdown, or should I say inactive government shutdown, as of last week. And so that is the phase we're in now, with those previous two phases still very much in play and all of their impacts in play. And then there's still a question of what, if we do get a budget passed at some point, what will that look like? So important to remember those stages. And maybe our colleagues are thinking about it differently, but that's kind of how we've structured the work in our region and to some degree in Wisconsin at large. We're also hoping our reporting will serve the state, not just our regional area. Next phase. Next slide. Sorry. So we also in our work are organizing around these categories: housing, food and household needs, health, workforce and immigration, education and the arts, civic health and participation or civil service, and then the way that philanthropy and the sector, just sort of in their own right, as a sector that is going to be responding to, has been responding and will continue to respond to all those other categories, the way that they themselves are impacted, either through direct policy that speaks to their work or affects their work, or the way that that sector is sort of having to flex with the ways that their communities are impacted across those other categories. Next slide. So other elements that I think are really important to consider here are that we have a lot of interaction between and among federal policy shifts and the way that states and local governments administer a lot of funding that has historically come from the federal sector, or might be responding sort of counteractively when federal policy has certain impacts. And so that is both a factor for the difficulty of understanding what the exact policy impacts will be from the federal, the things coming out of Washington, D.C., but also speaks to the need to look at those things together when we consider what the ultimate impacts will be, and where we might have levers in our communities, in our local governments, to influence the way that we sort of buffer against the worst impacts or the most concerning things. There is still a lot of uncertainty. So for our purposes and the work that we're doing, we're definitely fielding a lot of like immediate inputs from the nonprofit sector and our colleagues in Wisconsin in terms of the things they're feeling and seeing and what we're reading about and understanding. But we're trying to also do some information sorting and organization with what we have, with a very big understanding that exact impacts are not going to be that easy to ascertain, and it's still a very fluid context. And so we're doing a really iterative process to try to collate information, get out some interim reporting, get our best guess and framing and information out there so that people can sort of take what they can from it for their responses and their preparation. We are in the first stages, and what we will share today about some of the things we're seeing are very broad strokes. And I'm going to present some of our information very quickly today and share a little bit about where we're going with our work, but really with the idea that it's just framing up to hear from our colleagues from across the country. So I'm going to keep it moving pretty fast for our information. We also are dealing with a new information landscape, is the way that I would kind of characterize it, whereby it's a new way of navigating, I would say, like federal agencies and the information that they put out. There's a lot more license being taken with information on the websites of different federal agencies. Luckily, we do live in a country where we have a very big civil society, where a lot of important national and state-based think tanks and civil society organizations are also collating information, but we're really, in our perspective, needing to rely on a broad variety of those sources to kind of understand what's going on. So we know some things already. There have been, of course, in the early parts of 2025, major disruptions of funding and a toll on the administrative and professional culture of a lot of organizations, a lot of shocks to the system in that first phase of the Trump administration, with funding turning off for Head Start agencies, just to use one vivid example that people think of as an example of what they were able to do just through an administrative move, kind of like early in the administration. And And, a lot of those early shocks, while they still have ripple effects, some of that context has changed. A lot of the funding disruptions that's shifted in certain ways. But there remain a lot of ongoing concerns in the nonprofit sector that we know about programming and terminology, especially where federal funding is involved, and especially around those themes of DEI and the terms that have been associated with those concepts and put out in lists and things like that by the administration. And more recently, we've seen these direct threats to civil society, the closing of the third space, a term that I've in my career mostly seen in the international space, but feels very relevant in the current context where the notion of investigating organizations or their links to terrorism or revocation of tax exemption have just come up. Wherever you stand on the reason for that or the ideology involved or the goals involved, it's much more prevalent in the conversation in the news than I've ever seen in my career doing this work. So wherever an organization sits in the type of work that it's doing, I would take the position that using the threats of tax exemption or investigation of organization, or thinking about the links between organizations and terrorism, we want to be very mindful of the implications of that for the sector as a whole. Anticipating the expected impacts in communities and organizations is the phase that we've seen most recently. So this summer and now, what we're hearing from our philanthropic partners out in Wisconsin and our sort of anchor institutions in the nonprofit sector is we need to get a handle on what we're really going to see coming and what that's going to mean for the people that nonprofits traditionally serve, and the infrastructure out there, that supports our communities, and then the organizations themselves, in terms of any cuts to their funding or threats to their operations, vulnerabilities of those organizations, while they are presumably going to be trying to meet a bigger set of needs in the community, depending on what this legislation and these policy changes implicate. But I think a lot of people in the sector believe the needs will increase based on what we've seen so far. So the other big theme that we've been seeing is a really increased sense of urgency for nonprofit organizations and the sector at large to prepare and advocate for the sector as a whole. So a more solidarity kind of sensibility, I think, has emerged because, again, we haven't really seen these kinds of statements made before about like the nonprofit sector as a whole, or changes that implicate so many different parts of the nonprofit sector in one period of time or administration. So it's really, for Wisconsin, a place that hasn't had a consistent statewide nonprofit association, led to a new fire under us about whether we need to revisit that need for a statewide association and or a link directly to the National Council on Nonprofits, which I would posit itself has increased its advocacy and robustness as a national convener of the sector compared to past eras. I mean, it never before, I would say, has had such a comprehensive sort of nonprofit-wide set of concerns to sort of respond to. And that has certainly been the case in 2025. And indeed, they were the first organization, one of the very first organizations to litigate against executive orders that were to litigate against the federal government on executive orders that were affecting the sector. And they have produced an incredible amount of helpful materials about, for example, a full list of all the executive orders and the current status of those orders and things like that affect the sector. Next slide. So we're in a shutdown right now, and that is worth noting. We don't really know how long it's going to last, but one thing I don't really feel like I personally have a handle on, and I'd love to make sure we highlight today, is sort of what that particular thing means for nonprofits in Wisconsin and the U.S. But I do have this, statement from the president and CEO of the National Council of Nonprofits that, this shutdowns do tend to disrupt the work of nonprofits through grants that don't get distributed, or the inability to speak with an employee at a federal agency as needed if someone is laid off or furloughed. And so that seems of concern at this moment among all the other considerations we're going to think about. But I'll be honest, in the week or so since this has come to pass, I don't know that I have a very good sense of how it's affecting Wisconsin nonprofits. So I'd be interested what others have to say about that. Next slide. So we're going to kind of just really quickly breeze through some of these key categories. And one thing I'm going to share with everybody is that our small core team that's working on this white paper type endeavor to outline the impacts on Wisconsin and Dane County or the region, we will be sharing probably by early next week a breakdown, kind of a one-page or blog post kind of thing that will kind of pull out some of the key things we know in these categories for easy reference. And we'll be sharing that through our lists and things. So you should receive that if you're here today. We're not quite ready to publish it, but it is coming. And we will also have a longer form document that will be a fluid place where we'll have kind of a lot more content behind those top line points and the sources from which we've derived them, and that will also be shared. So be looking for those things coming early next week. But some of the highlights are here in these slides. Again, I'm going to move very quickly with those materials coming and wanting to create space for our partners. But we know that there are some aspects of housing, food, and household needs that are going to be heavily impacted by some of the phases of policy change that I've referred to. There is at that top line, the top point, arguably some things with tax credits and increased tax credits for childcare that could be helpful. But there's also some really concern for families. There's also some concerning reductions in SNAP benefit spending and a lot of imposition of new administration and requirements and some shifts to states. So you see some detail there. You can review that. I'm going to keep moving. And some changes for the earned income tax credit and reductions to the Social Security Administration in terms of accessing that office for the folks that rely on that in the later stage of the life cycle, especially, or that have other reasons for accessing those supports. And right now in the shutdown, another concerning thing that has arisen is that WIC benefits are set to expire just by the sheer nature of the shutdown. Next slide. Those are just a few high points. Health, we see some of course, this is the category that's been the most in the news, I think. Obviously, the reduction in Medicaid is putting a lot of nonprofit organizations and those that serve Medicaid recipients into a state of heavy concern. Very, very dramatic reductions and upticks in reporting requirements, which I think the sector arguably will probably bear a lot of the labor of that, because there are a lot of dedicated organizations that will try to support people in meeting those reporting requirements. We also know that the higher premium cost for ACA enrollees is likely to affect a lot of people that are maybe more in the middle class, or that would result in people not being able to continue to purchase insurance, especially small business owners and the like. We know that federally qualified health centers are in an uncertain state, and this might have even changed since I last checked, but I guess if we don't have the next budget, it's still in an uncertain state. And then some of the Medicaid dollars that are being reduced also relate to schools, which we'll talk about more in a moment. And then we know that there is this dramatic shift in vaccine policy and possibly availability. And there's reporting from just today that Americans are sort of bifurcating about where they're getting their information and what they trust about health. And I think that means a very different kind of landscape for public health or the institutions that support health than ever before, with a lot more fracturing. Next slide. Workforce and immigration. This is a space where we're hearing a lot from some of our wonderful organizations that we collaborate with that serve immigrant populations. I'm going to kind of draw people's attention to the bottom point here, which is we're hearing from organizations and seeing this, and we're getting a lot of news from Chicago, which is not exactly our area, but we're very nearby, just about the impacts and the ripples through communities with the presence of ICE being so much more prevalent. And, the way that that's impacting the way that certain parts of our communities might be engaging with supports or showing up in programs or in schools or medical appointments and the like, and that there's an increased need, of course, for legal supports, which we're actually seeing a lot of mobilization around that. But we also know that this is going to affect, the changes in policy are going to affect our workforce. And that relates to certain industries more than others. I'm sitting at an institution of higher ed right now, and we have a lot of relationships also with science and startup. And I think the H-1B shifts and seeing graduate students and people just knowing that they're probably not going to be coming back to the United States for certain things has been really noticeable, and faculty recruitment and things like that. Next slide. We also know that education and the arts are going to be and have been part of the policy agenda that's coming out of DC. I feel like folks here probably are quite familiar with a lot of these things. I guess just to say there's a lot of concern in education and higher education. And I just got a call yesterday from a colleague who does nonprofit programming in schools around civics education, where there's just a lot of heightened concern and scrutiny about programming and the way that we use words and talk about civics. And some of that is about direct federal funding, but some of it is just more ambient, and the way that some of our divides and some of the agendas are looking for, where there's that kind of programming happening, and how are people talking about it, and how do you navigate sort of continuing the work that you're trying to do without sort of running amok of either a federal grant or the way that folks are viewing your programming. We also know that the shutdown impacts the Department of Education right now. And so school districts are potentially at risk if they rely on some specific kinds of funding. And there are just employees at the Department of Education who are set to be laid off that would be supports to some of the grant-based or other kinds of work in our communities that will not be available. And then there are some distinct policies happening with school choice and vouchers, and then food in schools that are already very much on the table and expected to go forth through the reconciliation bill. And also cuts to arts and the humanities. So another factor I think are seeing organizations be very curious about is sort of how is civil society and how are citizens, or those in communities that want to sort of be a part of civic engagement in this context going to be impacted to be able to engage. And so there are some things about that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but there is just like one scenario that has come up in the last few days in Wisconsin that is quoted and described through a quote on the bottom of this slide that is very emblematic of the types of things we see in Wisconsin, where there's, for example, here a federal mandate, I guess, to verify the citizenship of voters. And we have a lower court saying that's going to affect the way we do elections in Wisconsin. And then we have another a public official saying, no, it's not. And so this is just an example in my mind of the way that like Wisconsin has really been dealing with a lot of back and forth on voting procedures and voter rolls and things for a long, long time. And it doesn't look like that's going away anytime soon either. And so above and beyond that, I just think, you see in the bigger points there, we see a lot of concerns right now about First Amendment considerations. We've seen some of our core organizations like AmeriCorps that sort of are about civic roles, supports of organizations being disrupted, which has meant the loss of some of those staff members for organizations. And we're seeing nonprofit organizations generally read the room and say, wow, we might need to be thinking about scenario planning differently. including options like wind down and merger, because we see that federal funding is going to change. We see that we're losing some staffing based on perhaps, discontinuation of grants or losing an AmeriCorps volunteer, or those things that can seem sort of small, but they can be determinative if you're already in the hustle of only having, a small staff, or relying on a few different types of grants, and one of those goes away. And then I think our philanthropic partners are thinking about, like, what can we do to support at this time, but also recognizing the sheer number of dollars that philanthropy could possibly contribute, even if you analyze all of the holdings of the philanthropic sector, will not make up for some of the scenarios that we think could be in play here. And so what's that going to look like? Next slide. Oh, so let's go back actually now. We'll show this one at the end. Let's go back to the one that shows the logos of our partners. Just to remind everybody who we're hearing from today. That's my little overview. And now I'd like to give 10 minutes to each of our partners that are here to share what they're seeing in their region. And you don't have to follow the categories or the considerations that we're seeing in Wisconsin, but I thought I would just share that first to kind of get us all considering those categories. I'd love to hear from some of you if we've missed anything in terms of our categories. But I know you'll have great perspective on what you're hearing from your partners in the sector. So let's get started.
Hi, thanks for having me today. My name is Tessa Tinkler. I'm with the Nonprofit Institute at the University of San Diego. And I know I joined one of these calls a while ago, so I've shared some of this information before. But a lot of what you shared is similar to what we've been hearing, as well, as so many of these impacts are nationwide. But I thought that I could share some data that we have from a survey that we did back in the spring and early summer. So back in February, right when everything happened, we did a large survey of nonprofit leaders, and we had a really big response rate because I think people were really concerned. And so we got over 400 responses. And from that survey, we asked if there was a smaller group that would be interested in continuing to provide feedback to us that we could share out. And there was 280 respondents that said, yes, we're open to continuing to provide some input. So that's what I was going to share, is kind of what we heard from the second group. All right, so I give you all a little bit of context, but this from March to June, let me see. What we did was we surveyed nonprofit leaders every other week, but we just asked them one question per week. So it would be a very quick lift for them and a quick lift for us to put back out the data. We were trying to do something, that could be responsive and quick, which means we don't have a full report. We just have a slide deck to share because we just wanted to get the data out quickly. And we wanted to share it with funders and other capacity building type organizations like ours in the region. So we ran this survey from March to June. And like I said, we would get the data one week and then we'd report it the following week. We did this for 16 weeks. Our sample was 281 leaders, but as you would anticipate, that's not how many we got each week. We had about 150 or so each week respond. So in week one, this was back in March, we asked, have recent federal actions led to changes to your programs or services? And, as you all see around the country, yes, 45% changed their approach to service or program delivery. 30% already at this time had reduced services or programs in some way. And then, 58% anticipated that they would need to. And this is a select all that apply. So that's why it does not add up to 100%. And then we wanted to understand collaboration and how organizations were collaborating with each other. So in week two, we asked if and how leaders had been collaborating with one another in response to these federal actions. And 63% had already started to collaborate to address recent federal actions. And then another third were interested, but felt that they lacked the bandwidth or knowledge to do so. And so we see this is something that has continued to come up in all of the work we've been doing over the last 6 to 9 months with nonprofits is they want to collaborate. They see it as a strategic opportunity given the federal or given all of the funding concerns. And so we've kind of been pushing in that area to support collaboration. And we asked, where do nonprofit leaders need support right now to address recent federal actions? And this, I will say, also is something these 5 areas have continued to come up past this survey and the work that we've been doing. So not surprisingly, the first one, strategic fundraising and grant writing, organizations are feeling, really stressed and uncertain about their financial positions. But like I said, collaborations and strategic partnerships was number 2. This was a pretty long list that they had to select from, 12 or 14, I think, options. And then it really struck us that number 3 was wellness and resilience of leaders and staff. So this was out of a long list. That was number 3 as a main, top concern right now. Communications, messaging, and narrative change really gets at what you had spoken to earlier and wanting to kind of develop more messaging around the nonprofit sector and more identity around that. And then board governance was number 5. I'm going to skip the quotes for time, but they do a really good job of exemplifying what we saw. And then we also wanted to understand, we'd been hearing like this isn't just a federal funding issue. They're really concerned about other funding cuts as well. So we asked any sort of changes that they expected from other funding sources. And we found, you can see with the red across the board, organizational leaders are expecting decreases in funding and not just federal, but from state, county, and city in San Diego as well. And then even a little less so with donors and foundations, but still the biggest percentage said that they were expecting a decrease. And then the other thing I'll just call your attention to is just how much uncertainty there actually is. There's a lot of gray here. They're really not certain what their financial situation is going to be. This was back in April. We asked a number of questions about boards and their engagement around this. I think I'll skip that, but just to say there's some increase in board engagement, but still 2/3 say kind of the board's still operating as normal. But what's not normal is what the board is focusing on. So they are spending a lot more time thinking about fundraising and resource development and strategizing about service delivery, risk management than they have in the past, even if the engagement is about the same. And then and this was in late May, we wanted to understand like how is this impacting the community? How are the impacts on the nonprofits impacting the communities they serve? And you can see here that by far the biggest impact is just increased fear, anxiety, or confusion. So 81% of the community of the leaders reported that this is kind of what their community is experiencing. And in San Diego, we're a border region, large immigrant population, and so there's a lot of fear and anxiety around ICE and particularly in education and health. And then we asked about staff morale. How has staff morale and emotional well-being at your organization been affected by recent federal actions? Emotional well-being, 91% felt like it's worsened recently. And then the staff morale was also, 80% also said worsened, but it was a little lower. And this was also coupled with an open-ended question. And we did have a lot of respondents say that, yes, staff morale is a challenge, but a lot of people feel more committed than ever to the work that they do. And so there's kind of that like double-edged. Emotional well-being is a challenge, but people feel some resolve to continue to do the work to serve their communities. These quotes kind of support that. And then in our final week, we asked nonprofit leaders what strengths and opportunities that exist currently in the sector that we can kind of act on and draw from right now. And this is what we heard. You know, for those of you all of the people on the call that work regularly with nonprofits, I think these will ring true to you. But people in leadership are our key assets. We share a collaborative spirit. Communities trust us. We are laser focused on purpose and impact, and we are adaptable and strong. So these are kind of like assets and strengths to draw from. I think that's the last slide. So let me stop sharing.
Perfect. That is wonderful research you did in such a short period of time.
And I guess the one other thing I just wanted to say, I don't have a slide on, but we also do a quarterly poll of San Diego residents, and we ask them questions about their confidence in nonprofits and government and institutions. And we've been worrying, you know, kind of wondering for some time, like, okay, is confidence going to go down as nonprofits are more in the, I don't know, in the media? There's kind of a more negative talk about nonprofits and what we've found is that's not the case yet, at least, that actually confidence in nonprofits is a little higher in the last quarter than it has been over the last few years. So I'll leave you with that bit of hope that the public still cares about the work that nonprofits are doing.
Thank you for that last note. That's not something we've considered yet, but I think that's a really important thing to think about as we also think about the trust in institutions theme that is, for some of our civic health work at least, like a huge factor in this era. And mostly you see declining statistics around trust in any kind of traditional institutions. But if there is a trend that nonprofits are an exception to that, that could be really important information to work with. So thank you so much, Tessa.
Yeah, and I will just say we are working with our state association right now, Cal Nonprofits, to put out a random sample survey of California residents that asks a number of questions about nonprofits. That'll be fielded in the next month, and so we'll have some interesting data about kind of what is the public thinking about nonprofits in the state.
Great. That makes me think a three-peat of this getting us all together might be in order come springtime or something like that. So, great. All right, Callie, based in Shreveport, Louisiana. We'd love to hear from you about what this is looking like in the Gulf.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for having me here. I'm Callie Dean. I'm the Applied Research Director at Louisiana State University in Shreveport's Institute for Nonprofit Administration Research, or INAR for short. I'm a late addition to the panel, so I've been thinking about this for all of a couple of hours. So I don't have a snazzy presentation, but I'm really excited to be here and share what I can share based on what we've been seeing in our area. I'm also new to INAR and to Louisiana State University in Shreveport. I began in this role in August, and so I'm still finding my bearings from that role as well. But prior to that, I was working as a grant development and program evaluation consultant, and still based in Louisiana. And so I think I've seen this from lots of different angles over the past several months. So a lot of the things that I've heard so far from Mary Beth and from Tessa resonate here as well. I mean, I think these are federal impacts that are having similar ripple effects throughout all of our different regions. One of the things that INAR has been doing, and we've been actually doing this for several years, is we host these periodic coffee and conversations sessions throughout the state. And so we do this in partnership with our statewide nonprofit organization. And so we have, like I said, in different regions of the state, these opportunities for nonprofit leaders to come together and convene and have kind of guided discussions around various topics. And so we've been doing this for several years, but this year we've really focused our discussions in on the impacts of the federal policies and government changes in general. And so we have a lot of anecdotal evidence. We've kind of taken a reverse approach as what Tessa described. So we've had these like anecdotal conversations, and then we've kind of coalesce the themes that we're hearing. And as of today, we're putting out a survey of the nonprofits that are involved in those coffee and conversations and various groups with the the statewide nonprofit organization, to get a little bit more structured detailed data about what those impacts are and how they're being felt throughout the state. So some of the things that we've been hearing, I think, are very similar to what we've heard so far. I think there's a lot of just general uncertainty about funding, about what's allowable, how things are going to change. I think there's a lot of bracing for impact, like knowing that some of the changes are having immediate impact, but I think there's an awareness that this is going to be a long road, and we don't know what those impacts are going to be yet, but we know that they're coming. And I think just overwhelm, like for a while, as was mentioned, we had these executive orders coming down, multiple executive orders a day. And so it was very difficult to keep up, very difficult to know, to find your footing. And so I think all of those things, like Tessa alluded to, are having an overall impact on morale and attitudes and just this feeling of not knowing what's coming. A lot of that uncertainty, a lot of the anxiety is around funding and looking for ways to come up with sustainable funding for their organizations. I will say, it's been mentioned that a lot of the funding impacts are trickle down. So there is some impact directly from the federal cuts, but also a lot of those cuts are being felt from the federal government to the state government, and then from the state government to local governments. And so I think the funding cuts are coming in multiple waves and in multiple areas. And so there's a feeling that, all of these different revenue streams are potentially at risk for folks. And what else was I going to say about that? Oh, I've also heard talk about how like local foundations are stepping up and philanthropic partners stepping up, and we're seeing that as well. So we've seen some of our local foundations in our area similarly convening some of their grantees and some nonprofit leaders to talk about how they can do more strategic fundraising and more strategic development practices. And so looking for some of those capacity building initiatives that can fill in the gap. But as has also been mentioned, I think there's this feeling that the foundations can step up a little bit, but they're not going to be able to fill in the gap entirely. So I was involved a couple of weeks ago with one of our local foundations. Every year releases a data set called Community Counts. And so what it is it looks at a variety of indicators for the Shreveport-Bossier metropolitan area. And that's a region that consists of 3 different parishes in the state. And so it looks at indicators around education and population and economics and health, all kinds of different things. And as we were kind of preparing to roll out this report, I think a lot of what our conversations revolved around is, making sure that the stakeholders who are in the room, who care about the community, who care about this data, understand what the impact will be as regards like the cuts to SNAP and the cuts to some of this federal aid, what that will do to poverty rates, and then the added burden that will be on the nonprofits in our region. So I wanted to share too, like I said, we've kind of taken all of this anecdotal evidence, the conversations that we're having in our community, and put it together in a federal policy impact survey that is launching today, actually. So over the next month, we're going to be visiting all of the regions of our state for these nonprofit impact conferences. And so it's another way to convene different nonprofit leaders. And at each of those conferences, we're going to deploy the survey and get responses from everybody who is there. And so I wanted to share the framework that we've kind of used to think about the different impacts of policy changes in 2025. One thing I haven't heard mentioned before is the process changes to the grants.gov website. That's something that we've heard from nonprofit leaders is having an impact in how complicated it is, how much time it's taking to even get in and fill out applications. And so that's one of the fields of inquiry that we're going down, is trying to see how those process changes have affected folks in terms of both time and other pain points, such as managing roles, user permissions, file validation, coordinating registrations, and just the availability of the site itself. Of course, federal funding cancellations and reductions is one of the areas of inquiry, and then the federal executive orders, and then also the state executive orders and policies, because in Louisiana, we have a conservative governor who's kind of been following behind the presidential executive orders with some of his own, and so I think nonprofits in our area are trying to navigate both at the same time, which is tricky. So I'm hoping that, again, after we have this survey out over the next month, we'll have more concrete data to share with you guys as well about what that's looking like throughout our state.
Wonderful. Well, again, I think a three-peat will be in order, and we'll be excited to hear about that reporting from Louisiana. And I'm also really enjoying hearing about the different methodologies that our guests here today are using, because it's making me think about some of the ways we could adopt some of those ideas into our plan to report. So I love not only hearing about the impacts here. I mean, it's also troubling, but it's useful to hear about the impacts, but it's also very useful to hear about the ways that nonprofit centers and conveners are kind of pulling together information in different ways. So thank you, Callie.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dave Bright. I am in Iowa City, Iowa. I can say that it is 67 degrees here and not a cloud in the sky behind me. It's actually been a beautiful week, which is more like a normal early October for us. Although typical Iowa, I had my air conditioning on in my house on Saturday and I had my heat on Sunday. So we're in sort of that transition mode where some days it's still very hot, but this feels more like normal, and the leaves are starting to turn a little bit and fall a little bit. We haven't had much fall colors yet, but that's kind of actually nice because then we'll have them later. So I am, like I said, I'm in Iowa City. I'm at the University of Iowa. Our very long name is the Larned A. Waterman Iowa Nonprofit Resource Center. We just shortened it to the Waterman Center for ease. We are housed in the College of Law here at the university. We were founded 25 years ago by Sandy Boyd, who had been a professor at the law school and had also been president of the University of Iowa and president of the Field Museum, and sort of specialized a little bit in his studies on nonprofits and tax-exempt organizations and cultural institutions. And he started this center to serve the nonprofit community in Iowa. And we are a mighty staff of 3. There are 2 lawyers, myself and the director of the center, Paul Thielen, and then we have an administrative person, Brenda Steinmetz, who works with us. And we always have a pretty high complement of students. I have, this fall I have 10 student interns plus 1 RA. Paul and I also teach at the law school. I teach art and entertainment law and cultural property and heritage, and Paul teaches nonprofit. It's class called nonprofit organizational effectiveness. It's essentially building a nonprofit tax-exempt organization from the ground up, and then sort of all the factors of the sector that go along with that. So we see quite a lot of students and we see quite a lot of organizations, because in addition to our faculty appointments, we have staff appointments here at the center. And we serviced, last year we serviced 463 nonprofits. And I think we had 600 or 700 projects within that. So many times we get into long-term relationships with organizations where we're seeing 4, 5, 6 times a year or so. We do a lot of survey work. We have not done anything in this area, partially because we just got done doing a large salary survey for the state that we combined with Nebraska on. And then we had our annual conference coming this fall. And so we hadn't done one yet in that area. But I will say, sort of anecdotally, when I was watching the slides from the first presentation, that's, I couldn't tell you if our numbers match those, but I can tell you that the themes match those, right? We're hearing those same things. We're hearing, it's uncertainty, stress, self-censorship, decreasing certain programs to sort of lay low for a while. A lot of the things that I saw on those slides, I could definitely, they definitely resonated with me, because that's what we're hearing from the people that we're working with. And prime example of it is actually an organization where we do work for them, but I'm also on the board. So it's a little bit of a unique perspective for me. But it's Humanities Iowa. It's the humanities organization for the state. And like every other one of the 56 councils that exist in the states and the territories. Our funding originally went away. In fact, we were literally expecting our money like on a Thursday, and Wednesday night we got an email that said you're not getting anything. And we were in line to receive, I think, 1.2 million for our annual allocation, which obviously was a humanities organization in receipt of federal humanities funds. We're a pass through, right? We're taking that money, and aside, other than our administrative costs for salaries and other things, everything we get, we're putting back out the door. And we had to immediately go into a sort of, okay, do we mothball? Do we shut down? Do we seek alternative funding? What do we do? We were very fortunate that the Mellon Foundation, exists basically because they gave us along with many other humanities organizations, gave us what is essentially a life-saving grant. I mean, they gave us money that had that money not come through, we would have just had to sort of either close it down or at least, mothball it for a while. But with that funding, and then with a subsequent partial award of what we were supposed to receive from the NEH, we received, I think, 45% of what we were supposed to get. Mellon also gave us a 50,000 matching grant challenge, so we were able to meet that. And then, frankly, that momentum helped us, because then once people saw that Mellon had given us money and was giving us a challenge grant, met the challenge grant, and we did get a partial award, it sort of jump started things for us. And now our executive director is still with us. We hired an administrator to assist her. We've started taking mini grant applications and partnership applications from people, and we're presenting, and we're back at it. But we have no idea. We have a limited 2-year budget. We have no idea what's coming next. We have no idea if next year we'll get a big goose egg, or if we'll get 45% again, or if we'll get 100% again. So we're being very conservative with our funds. I would say we're being very conservative with our programming. We're not looking to be the nail that's sticking up right now. That, as I say that sends an irritating feeling up my spine, because I feel like that's compromising sort of who we are. But when we think about, what's more important, right? Scoring a point today or surviving to tomorrow. We've decided that it's, we're not particularly at, that high profile anyway. So it's not like we have to fly under the radar, and we're not, in one of those areas where we're, using words that suddenly a lot of people don't seem to like the use of. But we still just felt like it's humanities are clearly being targeted, arts are clearly being targeted. And so it was sort of a good posture for us. But so I offered that, just sort of, like I said, it's a little unusual because I'm on the board. And so I have some additional insight into the operations of the organization and sort of where it's at. A little bit unusual, not unusual, different from just a straightforward client that we would work with. But the struggles and the things that organization is thinking about is just kind of an embodiment of what we're seeing from the organizations across the state. Iowa has the Iowa legislature and the governor are all Republican Party, have been passing a lot of K through 12 legislation, a lot of legislation focused on book bans, transgender rights, things like that. So we are definitely in a place where a lot of those principles and beliefs are being put into play through the legislature. So we also have to be very mindful of that. We're a regents institution. We are a branch of the state. We are a public institution. And so with a legislature and governor that are focused on those types of issues and have been at the K through 12 level and have seemed to work their way through that level, they now seem to be a little bit focused on the universities. And so as a center, we have that same experience that you never know when you might be the focus of somebody. And so we're very sensitive to it when we're working with organizations and very aware of it. But we have had a lot of people, the fundraising, reducing program, maintaining staff. I mean, honestly, a lot of the issues feel like COVID issues. And so in a way, it's, if you've had solutions that you had for organizations at that point in time, some of those strategies and approaches have been helpful in working with those organizations. But by and large, I would say that what we're seeing is very consistent with what the first two speakers talked about, just in terms of the issues and the fears and the amount of time that we're spending on this.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you, Dave. Wonderful
Yeah.
insights. And thanks for highlighting the humanities. We saw a very similar pattern of, activity and the roller coaster here in Wisconsin. And there's some really important things that are important to our center, even, some storytelling things about Wisconsinites and that
Yep.
are sadly, very disrupted right now. But it was an interesting example of the way that Mellon zeroed in on the 50-state swath of humanities
Absolutely.
organizations and was like, we're going to do a blanket thing to survive and advance. And it's not going to solve everything forever, but it does mean you didn't have to like completely let every employee go.
Thankfully we were able to, our executive director is terrific and is very loyal and has been with us for a while, and was even saying, look, I'll keep doing it, even for a while, if I have to for nothing for a while, and of course that's the absolute last thing you want to do to a person is, say, oh, that'd be great, we'd love to have you keep working and not pay you. So it was tough, but and along lines of what you were saying in terms of like humanities work, one of the things that the state recently decided to stop publication of the Annals of Iowa, which is a historical publication that I think comes out quarterly that talks about accomplishments and events in Iowa and of Iowans, and so that's one of the things that just sort of just got thrown up in the air, and we're trying to help that find a landing place. And so a lot of times too, we're in a position where we are, organizations that are in need, that have lost all of their funding and things, have been reaching out. And honestly, with a lot of those smaller organizations, one of the strategies that I've been working on with people is, look, if you're going to have to pivot to different funding sources anyway, because of the lack of federal funding, and this is only if, the percentage of federal funding across the budget was relatively small, but I've just been encouraging people to just stay away from government dollars, right? Like at this point in time, it's everything's such a football that, if you're somebody who, maybe only gets $10,000 or $15,000, some small kind of program or some kind of revenue line, find that somewhere else, find a private donor, move away from it, start to sort of make that shift. So then, ideally down the road, you don't have to deal with these things again, but at least you're not necessarily so subject to political whims and trends, and maybe your funding can be a little bit more stable. But with everybody competing for dollars, in a different way now because of those cuts, it's an easy thing for me sitting in my office to say to somebody, practically speaking, I'm very challenging and hard, but I just think sort of as a funding philosophy, just why bother? Right? It's just too stressful for most people. It's too uncertain. So.
Yeah, but also I think there's also a myth in some ways that all of the federal funding is coming from the federal government. I mean, the example of the humanities, many organizations that are applying to the State Humanities Council or the Municipal Government Innovation Grant opportunity, that it may not even be apparent that that's coming from federal dollars. So I think just to keep that in mind, that scaffolding is also makes that, I agree with that suggestion in many ways. I just think we also, it's sort of buried in a lot of other sources that people saw as more approachable as well too. So, and I really appreciate you raising COVID, because I think one thing to bookmark out of that and that we're seeing in Wisconsin is a lot of organizations have dealt with a major blow and what they were going to do to scenario plan already a few years ago. So maybe they've got some skills, but B, once the relief started coming through for COVID, organizations got situated, and we were actually seeing kind of like the decline of those funds before the administration came in. And so the roller coaster of like, there was actually an increase of federal funding that we saw with a lot of organizations during COVID once the relief came. Yeah. And then also a lack of preparedness at times for that coming to an end without being replaced. And so that was already in play. And so interesting how these phases are kind of interlocking in some ways too.
Yeah. You look at, we just did this, I'm on a museum board, and we were at a finance committee meeting, and we were looking at our cash balances just historically, we were doing a bunch of sort of kind of digging into our budget, trying to, address some things, and looking at the cash on hand, we had we had a pile of cash in 2022. I mean, we were just rolling in dough, and now we're back down to normal. And we had a newer member who came on and was wondering why we had declined. And we didn't really think about it at the time. And then we got in the meeting, we looked at it, and you could just see it. You could just see that, here's COVID, here's federal relief, and here we're back down to
Yeah.
normal. And then everybody
Yeah.
at that normal line was like, why are we so low? Why do we only have 300 grand in the bank? Why?
Right.
60,000 last year. And you're like, right.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Well, great insights from neighboring state. Thanks so much. And last but not least, I want to pivot to Roe Washington of the LaSalle University Nonprofit Center, or rather the Nonprofit Center at LaSalle University in Philadelphia. I don't believe our colleagues from Rutgers Camden at the Cure Center are here, but luckily we have two centers that we're friends with in Philadelphia. So we'll have Ro share with us what she and her team are seeing from there. Thanks for
Sure.
being here, Ro.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for having me. I will start with the most important question. It is about 60 degrees here in Philadelphia, so nice and chilly, which we're grateful for. A colleague and I were just talking this morning. It's a little hard to get in the spirit of picking pumpkins and going for apple cider when it's 85, which we've recently had. So hopefully this means we're getting actual fall weather and it's going to stick around for a little while. So we're excited.
Great.
So
Thanks
definitely,
for that.
yeah, of course, always happy to share what's going on in the Northeast here. Excited to be with you all, and thanks so much. Callie, I feel like I had a little more advance notice than you did, but I still don't have a slide deck, so you're in good company. But really excited to kind of talk through some of the stuff that we're seeing here just in Philadelphia, but also in our region. And so as many of you have already shared, starting back in January, that upheaval and kind of, era of what's happening took hold of the city very quickly. I think one of the biggest ones, in that very beginning stages was really parsing through accurate information. And so we had a lot of misinformation that was flying around. And so thankfully we have in the state of Pennsylvania, as many of you probably have as well, a state organization body who's really kind of connected to the advocacy aspect, who is really pumping out great and accurate information for people. So we spent a lot of time kind of disseminating that information for people to really know what was going on. Still, one of the biggest things, of course, that popped up in that January timeframe was this conversation specifically around DEI. We had a lot of questions that flooded into the center specifically about, hey, do we change our mission? Do we change our statements? Do we change our website? Like, what do we do? So we hosted a panel discussion in like the February-ish timeframe. We had about 650 folks, our organizations who registered across the state, because we did open up to the entire state, not just our region, specifically just about that. So it was definitely, a wanted discussion for people to have. And we had, leaders from different organizations and some of our state entities as well talk about their perspective on where it was coming from, in addition to having a few of our local nonprofit lawyers talk about the legality of it. So right out the jump, really trying to get some good and accurate information out to people at the top of the year. A lot of what we've seen throughout the rest of this year, and it's weird to think that we're sitting at not even a full year that this has been taking place, is similar to what everyone else has been saying in terms of both some concern and also, panic around some of the aspects, specifically around funding. I think coming through the summer and now into the fall season with, the big-ish beautiful bill we'll call, and all of the changes that are taking place around SNAP and Medicaid, it's really hitting some of our health and human services organizations right now. Some of the things that we've seen from those organizations in particular is getting this information out to people, because a lot of folks still don't know about the changes to SNAP and Medicaid, and they're going to be highly impacted and affected by this, but have no idea that it's coming down the pipe or is actually already started in the case of SNAP. So we saw a really good opportunity for our organizations to collaborate and really connect around how they get the messaging out, and our nonprofit specifically really taking on that task of how they're going to make sure that our residents here in the city of Philadelphia and the region understand that they have to do those, the paperwork aspects and the checking in aspects, those mandatory hours, all of that information that I'm sure has been floating around, but they weren't really aware how it was going to impact them. And so it was great to see this collegiality come together of how can we as a nonprofit sector in our region make sure this information gets out to people and what that looks like. And so the Nonprofit Center helped to kind of coordinate some of those aspects with different organizations and some of our state representatives around that kind of effort to get the information out specifically for our communities. And so that's been an ongoing effort as we continue to march towards some of those deadlines that are coming down the pipe really quickly specifically to make sure that people are aware of how it's going to impact them and the resources that are available to them. One of the great things about being here where we're located in the city is that we kind of sit at a cross section of not only some of our university partners, but also our nonprofit entities and a lot of our philanthropic entities as well. So we've connected with all of those folks to kind of figure out the best way to kind of work in that space. Another one that really came to the forefront, of course, is the funding. And so that's been both a opportunity and also a challenge, of course, across the city of how we both work with folks who are at a loss for funding. We have a lot of organizations here who are not, I won't say the majority of their budgets are made up of federal funding, but just enough to where it was going to, cause some pretty substantial issues with their funding streams. And so figuring out the best way for them to kind of both account for those lost dollars, which came very swiftly. We had a couple organizations smack in the middle of doing things like strategic planning over the summer with us at the center that we had to abruptly stop because they, got letters saying, hey, your funding for X, Y, and Z is being cut in no longer, 30 days or less. And so really trying to figure out how to pivot with some of those folks around scenario planning. The Nonprofit Center offers both consulting services, workshops, all sorts of things around everything with nonprofits. And so we've seen a real uptick in people asking for specifically scenario planning and what that looks like for their organization, not just with funding, but funding is one of the largest ones, but across the board. A downcrease definitely in this idea of long-term planning because folks are like, hey, we're just trying to make sure we're here for the next couple of months, let alone thinking about the next couple of years. And so what that looks like for both the sector's impact in terms of some of those organizations, but also how their staffs are taking that and running with it in terms of their planning as well. One of the other things, we think about specifically for our region and what we've seen is our philanthropic, our corporations and some of those foundation folks and how they've kind of come together. There's been this shift. I'm going to say it's a shift, but it should have been something that happened a long time ago with a lot of our philanthropic folks locally who really were trying to figure out how they could meet the moment, in quotation marks, which you've heard a lot in our region. I'm sure some of you have too, to provide funding that was a little more flexible to organizations. And so we had some of our bigger funders kind of pump out many more dollars than they have in the past couple of years since probably COVID to be able to just make it available to organizations, to be more flexible in terms of the way that they were requiring for applications, how their reporting had to be done, just understanding that obviously they can't solve the problem, but they wanted to try and do something. And so it was great to see a lot of them kind of come together and make that a concerted effort over the past 9 months or so. One of the things that came out of that is this discussion around our biggest 13 funders in Philadelphia specifically have come together and said, hey, we're going to do some pooled funding specific to capacity strengthening. And so they've been doing that over the past 9 months, give or take, and they're ready to kind of launch that program. It'll launch in January of this coming year. But with that, it's really this idea that like if the 13 largest funders in our area can come together, do some pooled funding specifically for our region around capacity strengthening and offer up to an individual entity or some coalition of entities to kind of coordinate that on behalf of the region, what could that look like? It's not a small undertaking by any stretch. So ourselves at the Nonprofit Center and several of our partners are one of several kind of groups going in to potentially, raise our hands and say, hey, we could be that entity, considering capacity strengthening is what we do at the center. And some of our partners have really strong attributes around, convening and coalition building and advocacy and some of those things. That's going to really shape the next couple of years, I think, for our sector in terms of that aspect, in terms of tool development and resources and how the sector is resourced. So instead of having it so fractional, amount a lot of our funders, they have a one-stop shop that folks can kind of go to. And so that might look like having just one, application for the entire region that they have to worry about because they're only going to have to send it to this one entity. It also looks like not having to, show up to 50 million things to get your funding because you think you have to, just to kind of appease the funders. And part of that conversation has been the funder saying, hey, we realize that, there's only so much that we can do, but we think we should be better about talking to each other. We should be better about coordinating this and figuring out how we can pour out some support to our region and what that's going to look like. So that's still in the works. Like I said, that entity will be selected at the end of this year for that program to get started in January. So we're hopeful that we'll be selected to be able to do that. But in either case, we're really excited about the fact that the funders have finally come together around this concept and are really trying hard to figure out how they can make a difference. We keep telling people, as I'm sure many of you have said, and I think Callie mentioned this in her presentation, we know that even if the funders in our region emptied all their coffers, it still wouldn't fill the gap. And they know that too. And so part of this is just being strategic about how we use those funds that they are pulling together to make the biggest impact in our region that we can. You've also really been intentional about having conversations around the changing landscape of just what the sector will look like, and being honest with people about the fact that this is a real tough time, as we all know, but we have to be for real and honest about what this means on the other side of this. We understand that a lot of organizations aren't going to make it out of this particular moment. And what does that mean for the communities that they're serving right now? And how do we make sure that those community members aren't lost and aren't no longer receiving services if those organizations are to shut down and close? Also looking at the fact that, this might mean that organizations need to merge or, consolidate down some of their efforts. Some of them might have to go under fiscal sponsorship, which is something we advocate for and tell people is a good opportunity for them as well. And so this is really forcing the conversation with boards and leaders specifically for them to have some of these tough conversations now, knowing that some of this stuff is really going to kind of boil to the surface over the next couple of months into a year. And so we don't want people to be caught unaware. We want them to start thinking about it right now and having those tough conversations with their partners, with their leadership team, with their boards specifically, and start looking around and saying, hey, what would it look like for us to merge with some other entities, for us to partner with people in a different way? And in the event that we have to close, how do we make sure that the people we're serving are not going to be negatively impacted? And so that conversation is really taking hold in the city as we kind of are trying our best to not be pessimistic, but we're trying to be realistic about what's going to happen. And so the Nonprofit Center has been working hard with folks to really do some surveying around that, but also have just great conversations and convenings around people who are interested in starting that process. We have, several entities and resources here in the city. One of them is a nonprofit repositioning fund, and so they're a huge partner of ours in what this endeavor will be. And so for them to be able to back some of those mergers and back some of those exploratory opportunities for people to think about changing their models and what that will look like, and so helping people navigate some of that and what it will mean for the sector when maybe we go from having 1 million nonprofits in the city of Philadelphia to sometimes potentially half that number, but then what it also means for the work that they're able to do. I appreciated, I think it was Tessa's survey that they had put together, because one of the big things we've also heard from a lot of people is around wellness. They're concerned about their staffs, they're concerned about their team members, they're concerned about their leaders, because this is already a stressful time. We were coming out of COVID and feeling like things were going to slightly get better, and then got dumped into another crisis, and now people are trying to just survive. And so a lot around how we provide really good resources to our nonprofit professionals and our leaders, making sure that we're connecting around how they can take care of themselves as they're taking care of so many other people, and what that really means for the sector as a whole, as we're looking at how some of those leaders deciding to walk away from, a very busy time of their life, and new leaders are going to have to step into that. And so that leadership transition and capacity is another aspect that the center and our partners here in the city are really paying close attention to. We've already had a big leadership shift as we got through COVID, and a lot of people retired. A lot of folks who maybe were thinking about sticking around for a little longer were like, I'm done. COVID is the last straw for me. And so we were thinking we are going to have to replace some of those key leaders across the sector. And now we're going to have to do it again so soon. And so that's really a big opportunity and also a challenge for our region to make sure that our organizations are still led and those leaders feel really well supported. So those are some of the big ones that we've been really navigating over the past 9 months. Again, it's weird to think that it's only been a couple of months, but there's also some bright spots that we think are going to come out of this. We've seen a really big push and authentic push around collaboration, which is something, for us, we've always kind of been on that soapbox of collaboration is so important. We have to do this. And now I think it's gone from like a nice idea to an imperative. And so people are being forced into like, we have to collaborate. And what does that look like? We have to, it's not just what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. How do we do this together? And so seeing that being a really intentional aspect that organizations are entering into without us forcing them to do it feels like something that's going to be a positive to come out of this. And we hope that's something that will carry over well past this particular crisis. The other one is really around advocacy, and how so many more organizations are advocating both for themselves and for the sector at this time, and really that they've never thought to do that, or maybe they thought they couldn't do it in the past. And so giving good information about how they can advocate and take part in those conversations has been huge. We have a couple of really great state advocacy organizations and folks who already do that, but having these individual organizations voice lend to that advocacy effort has been huge for the state, especially right now as we're looking at the state budget that also hasn't been passed in Pennsylvania, and what that means for them to start making some of those big decisions for when that hopefully will be passed soon. So that advocacy aspect has been a big one too, as people really step into a place that they've not done before. And so what does it mean for them to make sure that they're obviously operating within the guidelines of what they need to, but they're taking on this role of making sure that they continue beating the drum of why our sector is so important. We know, of course, that, nonprofits hire and employ, especially here in the Philadelphia region, about 33% of our population. And right now, we need our nonprofits more than ever. A lot of people are turning to our food banks, they're turning to our shelters, they're turning to the resources and tools that the nonprofits offer. And so we have to make sure that they're well supported and well resourced to make sure they can continue doing the work that they do.
Yeah. Wow, Ro and all of the panelists, whether or not you had slides, I feel so fortunate to have colleagues like you doing this work in other regions and who are able to distill such complexities, such sector-specific considerations that you have in your view, but also as experts, you understand how to talk about them and understand how to organize some of these key themes so very well. I've gotten a lot out of this discussion. Thank you all so much. I have a couple things, Ro. I love where you landed at the end of your comments, because I think there's two pieces I want to kind of call our shot on for the three-peat. One is, how are we turning this information that we're getting and what we're learning from the sector into more of a communication or advocacy agenda? I think we've many times seen philanthropy do bridge funding or do capacity building, and I think sometimes those things are needed, but they also need to be complemented with not just like what the sector always does, which is like patching the holes and getting better and more nimble at what we do. And like, where do we need to make sure that other decision makers and other sectors hear from these experts on the ground that are doing this work? The nonprofit sector, to your point, Ro, has such valuable input and perspective on how communities are affected by whatever policy or by whatever's happening in the world, and getting that voice together to really make sure that that's informing where we're going with public policy or where companies might be pitching in on things. I think that's really, really important. So I'd love for our next discussion to focus on how are we translating this knowledge into advocacy, into communications that can inform the general public, because very many people do not have an understanding right now of all the things that the nonprofit sector is actually doing and upholding. And the fact that we have to navigate all of these community impacts and the way that we work to support folks in the face of such impacts. And then also, I really appreciated your reference to the way that the sector might change through this, and being realistic about that. Another thing we are about to get more developed, that we've already launched in a pilot phase, is more of a query about what if things actually went right? Can we exercise that muscle of radical visioning as a sector so that we're not just in defense mode about things that are out of our control or are less than ideal? And how can we help shape how this all should really work, and what our communities would really look like, and how they really would be supported, and what reality that would be for all of us? Because I think this sector, again, has unique perspective on that positive visioning as well. And that could inform our North Star as we muddle through this current stage. So I'd love to open it up to questions from our participants, our audience. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand or place it in the chat, and we'll have our colleagues check that.
I had a semi-quick question. I don't know if it's actually even a quick
Please.
question. And I apologize because I can't remember if it was Tessa or Callie. I'm pretty sure it wasn't Dave, because I'm pretty sure it was a female voice. One of you was talking about polling local residents to kind of think about their confidence in the sector. What did that look like in terms of both deploying that? Like, how many questions were you talking about? How many times have you done it? I was just thinking that's something that, as we were having that conversation around people's confidence and we're talking about advocacy, that's something that I think we would like to explore here about what that looks like in terms of our actual, community members and residents and how they feel about the sector.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm happy to share. That was me. So there's two kind of pieces of it. We do quarterly polls of San Diego residents, but that is a little, it's through a market research panel. So it's not quite, as rigorous, but it's still, we've been doing it for over 10 years. So it does give us, it's a general sense of the trends. And you know, I'm always open to sharing what our surveys. I feel like surveys are the best way to. We should all steal each other's surveys to get the best questions. So I'm happy to share. But yeah, we ask questions about confidence in nonprofits, government, and corporations, and then we ask about volunteering and giving behavior, and also about awareness of nonprofit services. And so that's one piece that we do pretty regularly. And then this year, because we're partnering with Cal Nonprofits, we're doing a random sample survey. And so that'll be statewide. So that one is a bigger, you know, it's just a bigger cost. That's the reality. It's pricey to do, but that's another one where I'm happy to share the survey. It's almost final. It's supposed to be out in the next couple weeks. And that would be an interesting opportunity to look beyond California if there are other regions that are interested in doing something like that. So.
Yeah, that'd be great. If you're able to share, I would love to take a look. Thank you.
Yeah,
And
I
I'll
will
add, I would love
wait till
to
it's
as well.
final and then I'll send it.
And for your poll, Tessa, are you using the same questions every time each quarter and just comparing over time, or do you switch it up?
We have a set of questions that we pretty much don't change because we've been doing them for so long, but it is kind of nice because we have an opportunity to add questions here and there. So yeah, we usually add a few, maybe once a year we'll add a couple questions. It kind of depends. It's very responsive, and because we work with this market research firm and we have a strong relationship with them, they're pretty flexible. So sometimes we'll turn off a question and turn on another question.
Oh, great. Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just do a shameless plug that we do have a standing monthly meetup of nonprofit centers across the US that again is generated from contacts we've made at our Nova, but I feel like there's a lot of value in this cross-regional exchange. And so anyone else you want to refer into this group, I think we could keep these conversations also going in that closed setting. But then, yeah, I'd like to also, as I've mentioned a couple times today, bring this group forth again more publicly, you know, after a little bit more time has passed and we have more information as well. So I think we should all beg, steal, and borrow each other's, you know, innovations here. This is great. So I'm going to ask Michaela to go ahead and put up the thank you slide. I'm going to just go back through everyone we heard from today one more time to say thank you. Tessa from San Diego, Callie from Shreveport, Dave from Iowa City, and Roshonda or Ro from Philadelphia. Thank you all so much for your great work. And I hope you're staying well, because even when we're in the maybe slightly more removed from the front lines roles, but serving these organizations and trying to be responsive and say yes to ways we can support, it runs a big risk of burnout and being overbooked. And I know I want to thank our team at the Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies, because we are a small but mighty team, and we've been working really hard also to be available in meaningful ways, you know, during these times. So there's how you can stay in touch with us. And we have our upcoming slide is obviously not updated, but I will just mention instead that we will meet in November, on the 13th of November, same time, same place. That session will focus on global NGO work and philanthropy working abroad. So come on back and be with us for that. And we'll keep the conversations going. Thank you all so much for your interest in your work. And audience members, if you didn't get to a question or you want to stay in touch with us in different ways, feel free to reach out to us directly as well. Thank you.